So, hello everybody. We're now starting our second session. I hope you've all managed to have some coffee, some water. The day will probably be a bit long today. So in this session, Andrew Jefferson and Thomas Martin, both of the Danish Institute Against Torture, will give the first presentation. The paper is titled Penal Duress in Myanmar, Interrogating the Persistence and Mutation of Imperial Culturality. Following this, Sasha, Darke and Omar, both of the University of Westminster, will present a paper on the legacies of empire, coloniality, just war, and carceral injustice in Brazil. Professor Aliverti is the discussant, and after both presentations, she will make her comments, ask her questions, and so on. So just to remind everyone that presentations should last no longer than 20 minutes, but in this case, as we won't have the third presentation, you may go slightly a bit long. And yeah, but just bear in mind that we need to have some time for the Q&A later. Yeah, so before I hand over to Andrew and Thomas, I'll just give the audience some information again about the structure of the session. Any attendant can ask their questions to speakers, but only after the discussant finishes her comments. So you should raise your hands using the Zoom tool, and you only have kind of 2 minutes to ask your question, so we can this way allow other people to have the opportunity to ask their questions too. Feel free to use the Zoom chat to make comments during the conference, so you can always have a parallel dialogue through this channel. So again, just a reminder, this event is being recorded and it will be made available on YouTube later, but the Q&A is not included. So it seems to be all from me now. Andrew and Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks ever so much for including us in the program. I'm Andrew, this is Thomas. My own background is that I've been doing ethnographies of prison and prison reform in African countries and now moving to Southeast Asia. So very interested in the issues raised in the earlier session, of course. We're going to share the session and Thomas is going to kick off and I will take the second part.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, I'm Thomas Martin. I'm also senior researcher at Dignity and have been working with and alongside and inspired by Andrew for many years also on prison ethnography, mainly in Africa and Asia. So the paper we give today is something related to our joint work on Myanmar with our project on legacies of detention. Are you sharing the screen, Andrew? Excellent. All right, in this paper, drawing on ethnographic and archival material and case studies co-produced with our research partners in Myanmar, we explore the persistence and mutation of imperial carcerality in Myanmar. Resisting the urge to view imperial forms through a northern lens, we pursue an understanding of imperial carcerality as ubiquitous, yet distinctly situated penal phenomenon that has taken form through local colonial experiences and their afterlife. We are using the prison as prism onto other societal dynamics to discuss how imperial penal duress is endured and enduring in Myanmar today, not least in the dark shadows cast by the military coup on February 1st, 2021 and its fallout. Our purpose is to explore the notion and nature of imperial carcerality and penal duress, illustrated through analysis of penal and martial practices in historical and contemporary Myanmar. We will unpack the way in which two practices of domination and constraint with deep roots in imperial formations continue to animate penal practice in powerful, productive, and problematic ways. The paper is structured as follows. We begin with some remarks about the distinction between colonialism and imperialism, the imperial nature of the contemporary Myanmar military, and the nature of duress. Then we turn to two empirical examples, prison labor and the control of prisoners through coercive bodily practices called pon san. Following exemplification of these two practices, we dwell on the radically under-theorized notion of legacies as a means of thinking about recursive histories, and we list some characteristics of imperial carcerality. So first, imperial carcerality. The rich literature on colonial penality convincingly shows the centrality of imprisonment in colonial subjugation and extraction, and writes the penal experience into the history of colonial and post-colonial governance, including the case of Myanmar. We take inspiration from this literature, but we also seek to identify how a distinctly imperial form of imprisonment has remained vibrant and dominant in Myanmar, even as the explicit manifestations of colonialism have been dismantled or diffused. Following Edward Said, we underline the subtle difference between the imperial and the colonial and draw attention to the ways the Myanmar military has adopted, retained, and developed imperial sovereign practices as a form of rule. Myanmar prisons have been run by the military since the military coup in 1962. Continuing the colonial practices of British rule, military officers have managed Myanmar prisons for the last 60 years. This has also been the case during the recent period of democratization, where the prison service remained under the military-controlled Ministry of Interior, headed by a general and totally outside civilian control. As an integral part of the military, the prison, like the police, and, albeit indirectly, but to a great extent also the judiciary, has been used historically to eliminate enemies, gain control, and facilitate the perpetual conquest of the country. The perpetuation of imperial carcerality is shown today in the subjection of Myanmar prison actors to experiences of duress. The notion of duress is coined by the anthropologist Laura Ann Stoller, whose critical theorizing on the subtle and intimate production of empire has been highly inspirational for our analysis. This is how Stoller subtly delineates duress. Duress, she writes, captures three principal features of colonial histories of the present: the hardened, tenacious qualities of colonial effects, their extended, protracted temporalities, and not least, their durable, if sometimes intangible, constraints and confinements. And she continues, duress, as I conceive it, it is a relationship of actualized and anticipated violence. We adopt these takes on duress and the preceding reflections on imperial formations into our analysis of labor and Ponsan in what follows. So the first example, labor. Formally, penal labor is organized around three overall and somewhat conflicting objectives: to discipline, to exploit, and to rehabilitate prisoners. In practice, throughout its history, the prison has attached itself most strongly to the disciplinary and exploitative dimensions of labor, and less so to rehabilitation. As Pires notes regarding the penal landscapes of colonial Singapore, the imperatives of labor supplanted the prerogatives of punishment and reform. Similarly, archival evidence shows how senior colonial officials were more concerned with utilizing the labor of prisoners to make the areas they occupied inhabitable, that is, fit for Europeans, than they were with the risk to security of extramural prisoner labor. Penal labor is integral to empire. Laboring prisoners from galley slaves and onwards have been central to processes of conquering, controlling, populating, and extracting resources from newly acquired territories. European imperialism is a case in point. The British Empire pushed convicts from the metropole to populate colonial frontiers and forced indigenous penal subjects to first form and then serve the extractive infrastructures of the colonies. The importance of mobility to imperial projects entailed that the transient frontier camp is more central to imperial carcerality than the intransigent prison fortress. That is, empires rely more on barbed wire than on bricks. And the propensity to allow for local things and people to perish in the pursuit of setting up camp and meeting the spatial, economic, and strategic ends of empire de-emphasizes the prison's standard inclination to keep prisoners alive to serve their sentence. Imperial custodians are willing to kill and let die, linking imperial carcerality to post-colonial scholar Achille Mbembe's notion of necro politics. After the coup in 1962, the Myanmar military appropriated the colonial carceral infrastructure, not only in terms of prison buildings and penal technologies, but also to carceral techniques, the rules and procedures, and ultimately the complex relation between the incarcerating state and the incarcerated subjects. The State Law and Order Restoration Council, SLORC, which took power after the 1988 uprising in Myanmar and instigated a particular dark period of military rule in the 1990s and early 2000s, also took control of the labor camp system, facilitating the afflictive and lethal extraction of labor from the slaves of the military state, who built roads, cleared fields, crushed stones, and perished in the process. The labor camps of Myanmar persist, and one of the first and strongest exposés about Myanmar prisons shortly after the democratic government took office in 2015 was award-winning journalist Sui Win's undercover journalism about the prison labor camps. Sui Win reports documented the prisoners' harsh and hazardous working conditions and the significant financial interests of the military and allied private contractors in the production of gravel. Prison labor persists in Myanmar prison as well as the camps and takes two main forms. One is the organized labor that is often called prison work or industry. This involves brick making, forestry, agriculture, tending animals, cleaning, and so on, as well as hiring out prisoners' labor power. The second main sphere of prisoner labor relates to prisoner self-governance. Basically, prisoners manage and run the prison. They do the work that many would see as legitimate duty and responsibility of state official. This type of labor is an integral part of the prison's economy in the sense that roles and positions are purchased and sold, and occupying particular positions is a profit-making opportunity. This pragmatic approach to prison governance, which devolves authority to privileged indigenes in a system of violence, scarcity, and profit, is again a distinctly imperial form of rule that was integral to the convict officer of colonial prison, and which has endured contemporary practices. Played is in the maintenance of the bodily disciplining of fellow prisoners called Ponsan. We turn now to our second example of penal duress, another illustration of the continued potency and pervasiveness of imperial carcerality. And I give the word to Andrew.
Yes, thanks very much, Thomas. This is where I take over. So, tucked away in Appendix 30, near the end of the Burma Jail Manual, are a series of sketches that you see on the slide here. They show figures standing and squatting in a group before a so-called convict overseer who stands there baton at the ready. These ostensibly respectful bodily positions are the prototypes of a practice which continues to this day. It is known as Ponsan and is one of the defining features of contemporary prison governance in Myanmar. Rather than a posture of respect, contemporary Ponsan, and most likely its colonial predecessor too, is a practice of domination and subjection aimed to reproduce order and maintain discipline, often punitively. Our knowledge of this practice stems from a case study about the organization and regulation of everyday prison life, conducted by research partners in Myanmar. Ponsan today involves a range of different forms of deferential squatting. The different forms of Ponsan are for different situations. A 35-year-old male prisoner described it as follows. Ponsan is used when the prison is opened and closed. Ponsan 2 is used when taking porridge, rice, bathing, parade, going in and out of the gate. Ponsan 3 is used when the director, deputy, superintendent, deputy superintendent, jailer, deputy jailer staff, and any authority come into prison. I also memorized it, haha. If I don't memorize it, I would get a beating, haha, ha. So while prisoner leaders oversee the details of day-to-day prison life, the grease that lubricates this system is the practice of Ponsan. That is the inculcation of subordinate status through a combination of cognitive and bodily impositions. It's the key means through which bodies in Myanmar prisons are rendered docile and thereby amenable to the authority and control of the prisoner leaders and ultimately the mostly absent superintendent. Ponsan is a key part of broader practices of control and regulation, targeting the mind and the body. For example, there are also correct things to say, correct ways to avert your gaze for example, in the presence of the superintendent, correct ways to walk, for example, towards the toilet. The teaching of Ponzan is often accompanied by violence, which laces these rituals of bodily subjugation with menace and serves to instill fear, which is one of the predominant emotions expressed in our data set. Violence is used to instill fear and also as a punitive pedagogical tool for slow learners. A 21-year-old man reported thoughtfully how, quote, some people who are slow to learn Ponzan are often flogged by the Ponzan teacher. In sum, Ponzan is an integral part of initiation into prison life. It's a fundamentally corporeal, pedagogical, punitive practice and an integral part of the management and control of the captive prison population. It has a long history and it's clearly a form of duress. So far, we've presented two central examples of penal duress with imperial underpinnings. We turn now to consider the notion of legacies, to subject it to a little bit of critical analysis as a first step in rethinking the durability, persistence, and mutation of imperial formations. Stoller presents the notion of recursive history as a way of moving beyond naive questions about whether history repeats itself, a way to move beyond the choice of either rupture or continuity. The point is that history never goes away. It remains sedimented in experience and practice. It is never actually past. In Stoller's words, and here I quote on the slide, recursion is precisely not to imagine that social and political processes ever play out in repetitive and mimetic fashion. They are processes of partial reinscriptions, modified displacements, and amplified recuperations. They are not simply handed down, as it were, from generation to generation. Now, our research project is called Legacies of Detention, I should perhaps mention. And legacy is a term that is regularly used by commentators, by social scientists, by Omar and Sacha to come, to connect past and present. And a review we did of 500 plus abstracts that contain the word legacy or legacies reveals that in most of the cases, little attention is paid to what this term means or what work it does for the authors who use it. So our conclusion so far is that most social scientists actually who invoke a notion of legacies do so without giving it a second thought. And our contention is that the concept of legacies is not only overused, but it's also often used rather lazily and rather thoughtlessly. And of course, this is an opening for further analysis. So in our thinking around our project, we've been thinking about a legacy as something that can be that is handed down, passed on, left behind. It's a more or less deliberate mark of the past in the present. Legacies carry the past into the future. A legacy is an after effect. It outlives its giver. It's an imprint. It's not always clearly decipherable, not always easy to interpret. The handing down of a legacy is not never a simple practice of transfer. It's inscribed with meaning and symbolism, and its contemporary meaning is indeterminate. Thus, legacies, if we should even call them that, and that might be debatable, represent a hermeneutic challenge. So our proposition, and it's kind of tentative at this stage, is that thinking about legacies in a deeper way is a promising way to think about the way prisons persist and mutate and imperial formations endure and transform. Stoller's work, specifically her notion of historical recursions, promises to allow us to build on these initial reflections on the work that the concept of legacies or legacy might do for social scientists interested in historical transformations and states in the making. So coming to sort of a conclusion, or we really call it an interlude, as we're still thinking about these things, by applying the imperial prefix to carceral practices in Myanmar, we're drawing attention to the ways historical dynamics are sedimented in the contemporary lives of prisoners and prison staff in the form of penal duress. And somewhat schematically, we suggest that imperial carcerality can be approached as follows. Imprisonment is folded into a martial project of conquest and control, rather than a state-building project of punishment and order. The prisoner is considered an enemy under these conditions. Imprisonment is overinvested in extraction and underinvested in care. There's a routinized disregard for bureaucratic rules and an ingrained permissiveness of death. And finally, prison practices participate in the symbolic reproduction of imperial might. We believe that these imperial features continue to morph and matter to practices of imprisonment in Myanmar today. The nuanced analytical lenses of Laura Ann Stoller push us to think with and about imperial carcerality as a form of duress, conscious of the risks that important facets of sedimented practices get occluded by simplistic historical comparisons. In order to identify the affective and experiential manifestations of the visceral but evasive legacy that imperial carcerality represents, we think scholars must resist the inclination to simply tool up our evolving list of selection criteria and head to the field in search of empirical butterflies. Instead, we must tune in to our interlocutors' experiences of penal duress and hear them out about what they endure, and on that basis, struggle to create new vocabularies and means of making sense of contemporary imperial worlds. So with that, thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, that was brilliant. Thanks very much, both Andrew and Thomas. This was really a thought-provoking presentation. I think we could now move to Sasha and Omar presentation, if you're ready.
Okay, I was going to share my screen. I don't think Omar is using his slides, but I've got a few pictures, a few bits and pieces I'm going to show. So let me just do this first. Okay, so so this paper is Omar and I have just completed a paper which is under review on coloniality, just war and carceral injustice in Brazil, which has come out in punishment and society. So I've got the abstract there. I'm not going to go over it, but what we're going to do is I'm going to spend 5 minutes kind of reading the introduction, a slightly adjusted version of the introduction. Omar's going to focus on the concepts of coloniality and just war, and then the part on carceral injustice, Omar's going to talk a bit about the pre-trial process, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sentencing and prisons. Okay, so we start with these two quotes. Okay, the first one, which is taken from the president of the lower house of the first Brazilian National Congress. Okay, when Brazil had just received independence from Portugal, and this is debating about the need for a new penal code and the inclusion of the death penalty within it. And then the second quote is zooming forward 200 years to the current president, talking about the need to extend police powers in order to make the police even less likely to be prosecuted for extra legal killings as they already are. Okay, so let me read our introduction here. So the dichotomous positioning of good moral citizens in need of rights and protection, opposed to the barbaric and immoral people who required terrorizing, is present in both colonial and contemporary eras. In this paper, we explore the embedding of Portuguese colonial laws and rationalizations in Brazilian criminal justice. Inspired by Latin America's rich tradition of resistance or liberation criminology, we draw attention to the way Brazilian law functions as a barely disguised tool of vertical discipline and extermination, thinly justified, as Argentinian jurist Eugenio Raul Zaffaroni puts it, as necessary oppression of the hostile, of the enemies of society. Brazilian justice continues to be characterized by authoritarian and oppressive legal and extra-legal practices 500 years since the first Portuguese settlers arrived from the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century, 2 centuries after the end of colonial rule, and nearly 4 decades beyond the most recent period of civilian or military dictatorship. While the death penalty was formally abolished with the official end of slavery in the late 19th century, Brazil's post-colonial use of fearsome laws to terrorize the unruly and rebellious continues in the 21st century in the shape of the country's normalization of police violence, seen here to be celebrated by the current President Jair Bolsonaro. Importantly, unlike North America and Western Europe, the Latin American region was not going through a period of economic modernization at the time its legal and carceral systems were formed in the early decades of the 19th century. When Brazil gained independence from Portugal in 1822, its economy remained agricultural and dependent on forced labor. Its elites faced neither the threat of a revolutionary urban proletariat nor rural peasantry. Instead, their main internal security concern was how to contain insurrection among the country's enslaved population, much as it had been for the previous colonial authorities. Enslaved Africans constituted the majority of the population in 4 of the country's 5 provinces, including 64% in its most populous province of Rio de Janeiro. Whilst Brazil's newly formed National Congress introduced the death penalty as necessary defense of society, its purpose was to replace previous violent colonial laws that had already been used to subjugate its enslaved people for 3 centuries. So as we say later in the paper, this was how to continue business as normal. So in this paper, we focus on 2 areas of carceral controversy that Brazil shares with other parts of Latin America. Firstly, the de facto automatic remanding in custody and inevitability of successful prosecution of people arrested in flagrante delicto, caught in the act, widely considered a major case of, to quote Zaffaroni once more, penal illegality across the region, and often preceded by torture and punishment beatings. Omar will give a bit more detail in a moment. And secondly, my focus, the lack of any consistent legitimate rationale for sentencing and punishment, resulting in prisons serving little more purpose than, quoting Christopher Birkbeck, judicial internment is one of the country's subhuman prisons. In all cases, we'll see that the country's victims of such openly oppressive criminal justice practices remain disproportionately young, poor, and black. So central to our analysis is that, contrary to global hegemonic conceptualizations of universal rights, contemporary Brazilian society consists of a hierarchical reality in which some are deemed worthy of legal rights and protection, while others continue to be deemed socially expendable, even killable, and the targets rather than the benefactors of law. So this paper places the coloniality of power at the center of analysis by demonstrating that contemporary justice policies deployed by the Brazilian carceral state are just the latest attempts to legitimate violent techniques of war to disenfranchise and subordinate those deemed inferior in the capitalist interests of European descendant elites. We outline the initial just war narratives used during Portuguese colonization alongside the wider Iberian monarchical traditions explored by Nilo Batista and others at the Carioca Institute of Criminology in Rio, of hierarchy, militarism, and moral crusade, and the actions taken by Brazilian elites to justify the maintenance of slavery and continued subjugation of the descendants of the victims of slavery into the 20th century, including Latin American criminology's focus on criminal anthropology and complicity in social Darwinism and eugenics. So in doing so, we illustrate the through line of an emphasis on the rhetoric of war in the Brazilian case and its accompanying schema of justifications for the use of law to, in the words of Batista, disqualify and violently oppress. Okay, I'll now hand over to Omar.
Great, thank you, Sasha. And thank you, Luiz and Carla for arranging all this. And it's an absolute joy to be on a panel with Anna and Andrew and Thomas, whose work I enjoy and cite. Yes, this is brilliant. For my time, I really want to focus on this concept of, which is a very old concept, and want to show how there has been this through line that Sasha has spoken about. And it's relevant to today in contemporary understandings of justice and punishment in Brazil, and how this concept, still relevant today, is symptomatic of this larger concept that we grapple with of coloniality. And I can't resist Andrew's invitation about talking about legacies and things, and I really liked how he spoke about talking about as in terms of an imprint and not just a transfer. And I think this is what we're trying to get at here about when we're talking about legacies. About it wasn't something, when we talk about coloniality and the importance of these really base level concepts and how people experience and see the world, it wasn't something that's just passed down to the next person. This is the way it is. It's something, it's, you know, we're all swimming in the same waters, and it's something that we remake as we go along and participate in actively. So what we argue in the paper is that the ontological positionality established during the colonial period remains today. And so in order to talk about that, we need to go back even before the colonial period. And so we talk about the Iberian Peninsula and how just war was conceptualized during this period and used to legitimate and justify horrendous acts of genocide and murder and enslavement. And so we see in the 14th century, the Pope sanctioning war and the colonization of the Canary Islands. In the 15th century, we see Dom João going to great lengths to try and ensure that his expansion into Morocco was seen in service to God. And we go back to this point because we want to show that there's a specific kind of logic that was set, that got taken across into the Americas, whereby the people doing the colonization felt sort of comfortable in the knowledge that the fonts of morality at the time, the Pope and the King, had sanctioned this. And so the murdering and the enslavement they were doing was part of what was described as a moral crusade. And so with this morality, you know, putting the wind in their sails, this centered from the very outset the duality of the conqueror and the conquered. And this was something that, you know, is a warlike mentality and is something that you establish in the moments of war, but usually conceptualized when it's in peacetime, that you don't have this kind of dichotomy. But what we argue is that this warlike mentality gained a level of permanence and becomes normalized. And so we see in the further establishments of settlements throughout the Americas, and of course we're focusing on Brazil here, we see the colonizers use what they call tropas de guerra, which is literally translates as war forces, where groups of the Portuguese would go into indigenous areas, and they had this lethal force approved by the authorities to be able to punish the hostile indigenous peoples. And what that meant was that anybody that refused Christianity or posed any kind of threat to the interests, the capitalist interests of the colonizing forces, were able to be murdered or enslaved. And these war forces that went into the forests and other areas, they were often accompanied by Jesuit priests, and they were the ones who decided whether enslavement was warranted at this point, or murder was warranted. And so constantly there was this religious justification in allowing the violent arm of the colonizers. And so we see this justification through moral crusade. But as well as that, there's this particular Iberian influence of the Inquisition that was happening at the time as well. And so the legitimization of the investigation of possible crime and the practice of punishment, it was normalized through these mechanisms of extreme violence and how torture was used in order to extract confession. And so over the years, we see these kind of legitimizations used, and an increase in this sort of what we've called a law and order rhetoric, where these same warlike practices that, again, are meant to only be used in extreme circumstances, are used on a regular basis to, the phrase that was used at the time was to reduce the peoples to peace and civil conformity. So enslavement, murder was used to reduce people to peace, which obviously is oxymoronical, but we also see terms such as pacification used, which many scholars have shown is just really a euphemism for conquest. And obviously pacification, for any of those people familiar with Brazil, is a particularly interesting phrase, especially before the World Cup and Olympics recently, and the pacification of people in favelas. And so we can talk about whether that was also a euphemism for conquest as well. So while this is happening in the souths of America, we also see these moral crusades happening across Africa, and for the Portuguese Empire, it was particularly Angola and the Congo. And here we see how, again, when we're thinking about punishment and justice practices, we see the advocation for fearsome instruments to discipline and enslaved peoples. And it was encouraged to really use this violence as a way to control groups that you wanted to control. And increasingly we saw the invention of race during this time, and this creation of this racialized hierarchy. And, you know, we've mentioned coloniality before, and I've kind of skipped across that a little bit because I'm assuming some knowledge of that before, but I'm happy to come back to that in the questions. But really we center around Quijano's discussions of coloniality of power, which revolves around this kind of dual concepts of a racialized hierarchy and the centralization of a exploitative globalized capitalism. And so, of course, when we see the enforced movement of peoples from one continent to another in order to work on plantations, we see both of those things in action. And over time, although the dependency on overt religious sanctioning of just wars wanes over time, what does remain is this underlying European white supremacist assumptions that pervade all decision-making around justice and power. So while these just wars begin with religious sanctions, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we see these justifications for warlike tactics move from religious justifications to pseudo-scientific justifications. So this is when we see the social Darwinism be introduced in order to legitimate this kind of racialized hierarchy that had been assumed, and they used to legitimate the assumptions around this racist civic hierarchy. And we see the state, the Brazilian state, make overt attempts to whiten the Brazilian population, and this increased fascination with blood. And anyone who's non-white is seen as a threat to the very future of the nation. So anybody not white, anybody not European, is interpreted as an enemy that can be justifiably eliminated. And further into the 20th century, we see the Brazilian government flirt very closely with Nazi ideas of eugenics and really contemplate employing those. So we see this real violent policies being discussed in Brazil. So the point making of this history of it is that despite emancipation at this point, despite the birth of a republic and official decolonization, although not in reality, we could say, the underlying ontological position that was created during that point had gained a normality, and it remains in this way. And so, again, emphasizing racial hierarchy and exploitative capitalist interests. So then when we turn to think about contemporary justice practices, through the 20th century and into the 21st, we describe how these civic divisions remain, and how the majority of Brazilians are fully aware of these divisions. Even though everybody is equal on paper, everybody has rights on paper, people are aware of their position of relative social weakness, and the logic that lethal violence is acceptable to deal with any problematic groups that threaten the elites and the central power. That's acceptable to use. But we're clear that this is a very political choice. This violence is targeted at certain geographies, i.e. favelas and places of underserved neighborhoods, and particular demographics, i.e. mostly Black people, indigenous people, anyone from multiple heritage that isn't identifiably white. And so we see governors of Brazil saying they want to shoot people from helicopters or shoot missiles into favelas. We see today extrajudicial murders carried out by police at levels that exceed genuine wars that are happening elsewhere in the world. And so violence still is legitimated. Warlike violence is still legitimated as a means to resolve conflict with certain oppressed groups. So this is justified war tactics. And it's all conceptualized within the rhetoric of a moral fight, that whether it's a war against drugs or a war against corruption, we're saving our children somehow by perpetrating this further violence. And torture continues to be used as a way to extract confession. Judges arguably act as security agents in custodial hearings, and in the style of this Inquisition, we still see these things legitimated. And Bolsonaro, who some people have said that using quotes about him might be presenting a straw man to be knocked down, but this is the president who's representing a lot of things. I saw somebody in the text mention a phrase that he's used regularly. It wasn't his phrase, but he's used bandido bom e bandido morto, which is the only good criminal is a dead criminal, or bandit. And Bolsonaro said, "I defend torture. A drug dealer who acts on the streets against our children must immediately be put on a parrot's perch," which is a form of torture, and also interesting links to what Andrew was talking about in his presentation. The idea that it's legitimate to torture somebody in order to gain confession is just such clear resonance with the Inquisition before. So I'm going to pass back to Sasha now, but overall the point that I'm trying to make is that we have today modern moral crusades, justified war tactics, which legitimate violence to convict people, to imprison people, and actually to eliminate people. Anybody considered outside those who are deemed worthy, and labeling them as an internal enemy. But I'll leave it there. Back to you, Sasha.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll just add to what Omar said there for people who from Brazil know Brazil well. I'm not sure what it's like in other parts of South America. Is these discourses, how they are supported by the public. I think this is absolutely fundamental. Lots of people know here that I'm married to a Brazilian, and luckily she's not in the room now because this is the majority of her family. Her extended family, are highly supportive, and like a lot of other people, they didn't want to vote for Bolsonaro, but the moment it came to between the left and the right, in the second round of the presidential election, then everyone's going to do so. And I remember the film, Tropa de Elite, about basically showed a lot of police killing, and I remember so well how people, it reminded me of Rocky when I was a kid. We were all jumping up and down in the cinema as Rocky was beating up the Russian. We find a similar situation in Brazil where people were literally in the cinema excited to see how many people the police were killing. So these are really, really crucial points. But I'm going to finish off with some words on prisons. Okay, so again, I'm going to read. Now we've got a bit more time than we thought we'd have, but this means I can at least get it done in 5 minutes. So I'm just going to read here a couple of pages. So judicial internment is what we're focused on for the second part. So our second illustration concerns the inhumanity of Brazilian prisons, the inhuman nature of Brazilian prisons. So similar to the use of whipping and hard labor as legal punishments for enslaved people during the post-colonial monarchical period of the 19th century, imprisonment in Brazil should be understood first and foremost as a legalized measure of last resort, as a system, to quote Mauricio Gieta, of belated intimidation and discipline rather than rehabilitation, where other violence measures, including extra-legal police beatings, have failed. So we know, for example, if it comes to something like homicide, only about 10% of homicides result in somebody in prison. Okay, there are other control mechanisms that can come before that. So, as in other parts of Latin America, Brazil had inaugurated a modern penitentiary system across much of the country by the late 19th century, in place of its colonial system of ad hoc detention in naval vessels and in forts and dungeons by military, local government and religious authorities. Yet in contrast to their North American and Western European counterparts, they proved to be, in the words of Ricardo Salvatore and Carlos Aguirre, houses of disease and death. So I've got the pictures here of the original design for the House of Correction in Rio, which was taken from British designs, okay, which were made in the 1820s, of the idea of a panoptical prison. But the point is that these places turned out to be anything but that. Okay, so we know, for example, that the majority of people who remanded in this prison, which did have one of the wings turned out to be a house of detention, most people were eventually acquitted. And we also know that a third of prisoners who served more than 2 years died before they got out of prison. 1/3 of people. So so this is nothing. This is not a house of correction. It wasn't right from the beginning. And the same with similar these places in Recife here, which I'd love to go to because I know this still exists. So Brazilian prisons remained places of judicial internment into the 20th century. So among the few academic studies of Brazilian prisons completed in the pre-1985 democratic period, Edmundo Campos Coelho described conditions of detention in Rio de Janeiro of as little as 1.5 square meters per cell space per prisoner. So the inhumanity of the pre-democratic Brazilian prison system was also highlighted in prisoner autobiographies of the period, including the novelist Graciliano Ramos, who was held without charge for 10 months as a political prisoner in Rio de Janeiro between 1936 and 1937, including in this famous penal colony of Candido Mendes, William da Silva Lima, who played a central role in forming Brazil's first major prison gang, the Red Command, in the same prison in the early 1980s, and Luiz Alberto Mendes, who spent 3 decades in prison between 1972 and 2001, including in the infamous Carandiru prison. So all 3 of these authors describe conditions of severe overcrowding. Remember here we're talking about the mid-20th century, and periods in which they were locked up 23 or 24 hours a day, 3 to 5 a single cell. And Lima and Mendes also describe numerous incidents in which they were subjected to disciplinary beatings by prison guards, or as continues today to a certain extent during raids by military police. So today it is quite usual for a prisoner to be accommodated in poorly ventilated cells or multi-occupancy dormitories holding 2 or 3 people per square metre, with little access to running water or healthy food. So just to give some images here, this first one here was taken by a judge I was with on the day. I've never shared this kind of picture and I find it hard to even show it. But these are kind of conditions I encounter so many times over the country. So in Curitiba, there are something like 10 to 12,000 people still stuck in police stations in these kinds of absolutely horrific conditions. And in this particular lockup here, they were not getting out of their cells at all while they were there, and they could have been there quite easily for 6 months. If you look at the Remand prison system, so here in São Paulo, I'm thinking of where there are more than 100,000 remand prisoners in this state. So I don't have time to go over these sort of models, but if we get down to this kind of cell here, we're talking about a cell of perhaps 12 square meters. And certainly Karina Bionji, who I work with a lot, has been to places where she's found 60 people in these conditions. I've been in these places and I regularly find 30 to 40 people in a 12 square meter cell. This is completely and utterly normal. Infamously, it's now going on to the closed prison system, probably the most horrific prison I've been to in Brazil, okay, in the south of the country, where this prison is so overcrowded. It's famous that people literally sleeping in the corridors have taken. Yeah, I mean, so painting a picture here of what the system is like today. Petrolinho is a Maranhão in the north of Brazil, which I went to twice just before the pandemic. Again, these are kind of horrific conditions that you can find. This here is on the so-called neutral wing, the wing that doesn't have a gang, except I've heard that since they've now created the neutral gang. That's a different story, which I'm not talking about today. But we have a situation here where I've been in where one of these situations here talking to the prisoners, over 50 degrees centigrade, right in the north coast of the country, and people are stuck in horrific conditions, stuck in these cells. And yes, they will be allowed out into this corridor for 1 or 2 hours a day, but they're not getting out into the exercise yard. Okay, so I've only got a couple more things to say to add on here. So only half of the country's prisons have functioning health centres.
Sorry, Sasha.
Yeah.
Could I just tell you that you'd be out of time if you could go and conclude your talk?
I'll just finish. I won't talk about this slide here. There's just me finish about 3 sentences. So we're talking about these horrific conditions. The question is how to explain them. So it's the overcrowding, it's the lack of healthcare. Okay, typically a prison with 2,500 people will have a doctor there on a Friday afternoon. We're talking about places of running water for sometimes only 2 to 3 hours a day. And we're talking about places where guards literally don't go into these spaces and they're left to self-govern. And finally, last point, in terms of violence from prison staff, yes, the gang system to a certain extent has put a halt to that, but what we still find is violence being committed against prisoners in police stations and on their way into prison, very often still being delivered in prison, sometimes still with bullets stuck inside them. Okay, so thank you. That's all I needed to say. Thank you, Luiz.
Yes, thank you very much. It was amazing. Thank you, Sasha and Omar. This was another great presentation. Anna, would you like to make your comments now?
I have just readmitted her. Just 1 second, please.
Just admit, yeah.
Okay. Anna, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, my computer decided to shut off. Very opportune.
Okay, so you can make your comments if you want.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for sharing your work. These are really rich and stimulating papers, and I think they. So I learned a lot from both of them, and particularly, well, the Myanmar paper, because it's a jurisdiction which I'm not very familiar with. I'm more familiar with Brazil, so I learned quite a lot equally from both. So it's a pity that Enrique and Anastasia couldn't make it. I think both papers speak to each other in different ways, and there's a few parallels there that I would like to remark the beginning of my comments and then go into a greater depth into each of the papers. So there are three things that I would like to note as common features and common things going on here, and perhaps with some divergent ideas about these concepts. So the idea of continuity. Both papers look at these protected practices and endurance of colonial forms, particularly through the idea of penal power and penalty. The second issue is the question of punishment, which I think both papers engage very well with that and with the central concept of the workshop, but present perhaps different ideas and different focus on punishment, with the paper very much focused on the prison and what they call imperial culturality. And Sasha's and Omar's paper presenting a more diffuse concept of penalty and punishment, and its instantiations in various different historical moments in Brazil. And the third theme that I think is much more directly engaged with in the Brazilian paper is the idea of citizenship and the way in which penal power really reinforce ideas of citizenships and degraded citizenships in terms of the intensity and the focus of the populations that are subject to these practices. So in terms of Andrews and Thomas paper, they focus on two particular aspects of prison regime and prison practices, penal labor, and the disciplinary practice of punsa, and trace in a very rich and engaging way their colonial provenance. And this paper, I think one of the central contributions of the paper is the conceptual engagement with the temporal dimension of penal practices and the endurance, what they call penal duress, drawing on Stoller's work, which for me is also a very important starting point to think about colonial forms and the endurance of colonial forms in contemporary conditions, not as a linear transition or as a rupture, but more of in terms of sedimentation and in terms of, you know, mutations, colonial mutations, in which there is no, you know, kind of absolute and total kind of follow-up or reinstantiation of a particular practices, but much more mutations and a more nuanced process. And she conceptualized this idea of duress as a muted condition of constraint that I think is really an interesting concept to that you, of course, you brought it up in your paper and to reflect upon. And also Stoller's work for me is really interesting in the sense that with other post-colonial scholars, you know, I unsettle or question this idea of history as something that is completely casual in the past, and there's a clear line between past and present. So there's a greater engagement with the concept of history itself. And here in this paper, I think it's dealt very well. And so this interrogation of the post in post-colonial studies. So I want to make three comments, specific comments, and perhaps in terms of the how I can see that the paper could be developed a little bit further along the lines of the issues that you raised here. So the first one is the distinction between the material and the cultural. There is very much at stake in colonial studies and cultural studies. This critique, particularly in Edward Said's work, concretely in Culture and Imperialism, where you know, he said that we cannot understand imperialism as just a process of economic extraction, and and of course we need to you know, acknowledge that colonialism has been very much driven by economic extraction at the global level, and hence the importance of slavery and modern capitalism. But Said says that we need to interrogate also the cultural forms of colonialism in the terms of representations, and of course Orientalism is a kind of an attempt to engage with those representations in terms of art, in terms of stories, explorers' diaries, narratives, through which colonial domination was achieved, and the power, its enduring power in contemporary conditions. And I think that this dichotomy between material and the cultural in colonial studies could be brought a little bit to bear on your assessment of extraction and prison labor, right? Where you argue at some point in the paper that in the context of colonial Burma and post-colonial Myanmar, the issue of extractive and exploitative, the exploitative function of the prison was central and continues to be central. I wonder if such argument might neglect non-economic and non-utilitarian aspects of dimensions of labor. And perhaps as a side point, the question of necropolitics that you raised as well, drawing on the work of Nembe, it in a sense contradicts this idea of labor and extractive labor as a single function of the prison. I think perhaps you can think about the amalgamation of conflicting rationalities at stake in this particular space and the functionality of the prison in terms of the extractive, the disciplinary, and the rehabilitative logics that dovetail dovetail with each other, and in turn with more neoliberal rationalities. And I think you brought the question of self-governance and self-management of the prisoners in there, and perhaps you can make a little bit more space to think about this sedimentation of different rationalities that scholars talk about, to think about colonial and neoliberal logics that are at play here. I think this analysis and in terms of amalgamation of different logics is more present in the analysis of the Punsam, which again, under contemporary conditions, mix the colonial logic of hierarchical authority and authoritarianism with a more modern idea of self-rule. And I think in that particular context of the Punsam, the centrality of the institutional laid out of Myanmar prisons in terms of being administered and managed by the military is something that you can bring a little bit more to speak to that kind of disciplinary function of the Punsam. I found really interesting the way in which you explore at the beginning of the paper the role of the military in prison discipline and management, and perhaps that's less so connected to that Punsam specific analysis of the Punsam. A second point that I wanted to make is about the question of race. So it is interesting that in both practices that you're focusing on your analysis, the locus of these practices is the body. the body of the prisoner. And it's a bit surprising not to see more excavation into the issue of race and the racial economies of the prison and punishment more generally at place in these spaces, and how they relate to broader social context, particularly given importance of race in Stoller's work. So there is some mention of this entanglement between roace and prison and the extent to which they play out in more contemporary conditions, particularly in the Rohingya crisis, but perhaps that can be explored a little bit further. A third aspect that I want you to comment on is about the methodology, and I would like to learn more about how this project, what was the data that you rely upon for this project. This is really the extract that you brought up and you rely on in the paper are really rich, both in terms of interviews and archival material. Perhaps you can be more explicit about your methodological design, and also this co-production of with local researchers. Again, it has to do with the politics of research and field work, which is quite important as well for understanding the findings. So there is quite a bit of detail in terms of the search of legacy as a word, as a term, as a notion, academic publications, but there is less space devoted to the more empirical analysis and archival and field work. Okay, so in relation to Sasha and Omar's paper, I thought the paper is very rich in the historical detail that they engage with in terms of tracing the nature of state violence in colonial times, and how the problem of insurrection of the majority slave population really shape that exercise, that and in turn the institutions, penal institutions, the question of containment, of resistance, and the question of placating resistance, both not only through the exclusion and the incapacitation of entire populations, but very literally on the extermination of certain groups. I would like to ask you on that particular aspect, the centrality of violence to force to contain, because in studies, historical studies on the British Empire, and particularly colonial policing, there's quite a lot of analysis and study about the role of violence and force for political domination, and some of the findings that come up from that work is that in many cases, force was not a single, it wasn't necessarily and counterintuitively, perhaps it wasn't the main tool and mechanism to compliance. So the British, for example, in India and the Middle East, used informants, native people that gather intelligence and and through them they could, you know, prevent insurrections and placate resistance. And I wonder to what extent that was at place as well in the Brazilian case. So this idea, and coming back to this question of the temporal continuity of practices that both Andrew and Thomas were focused on, the concept of the just or sacred war is really interesting to understand both the role of religion in contemporary as a legitimizing aspect of state violence and colonial expansion, and how that kind of mutate into the questions of eugenic science there to justify the same. And in more recent times, the rhetorics on the war on crime, mano dura in South American kind of language, or zero tolerance policing that Bolsonaro obviously took advantage of, taking advantage of, with tragic consequences. I think that idea of the just war is really nicely connect the kind of temporal aspects of your paper. I'm not so sure about the practices that you focus on, or if the focus of the practices of arrest and imprisonment and pre-trial excessive use of pre-trial imprisonments really resonates with that idea of the just war, in part because I think so you are focusing very much on the judicial, right? What seems to me that is going on in Brazil and is implicit in your paper somehow is a centrality of extrajudicial punishment and the central role of the police for ensuring that, and obviously you mentioned, that 90% of drug sentences are passed just by the testimony of the police. That is when there is a suspect, but we know, as you mentioned in your presentation, that Brazil is one of the most violent countries in the world, with record numbers of homicides, but also police killing that has been amplified in the last 2 years. So I wonder if you can reflect on this, of the very distinctive nature of the role of the police in relation to that containment function that you referred to at the beginning of the paper. And in line with that, the idea of the law, the relationship between law and violence, that also is I think is very interesting for the Brazilian context, but also for the South American and Central America context, where the law is continuously devalued, right, through the use of pretrial detention, extrajudicial killing, disproportionate use of force by the police, but at the same time revalued and fetishized even. And I wonder if there is a space in the paper to reflect on that contradictory dynamics going on in relation to the place of the law and violence in the context of punishment. And the third.
Sorry to interrupt you, Anna. Could you just conclude your comments, because we are running out of time now. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I am almost done. And the last point is a question of legitimacy, again brought about in the presentation, the extent to which these mano dura campaigns have received significant public support, and there's quite a lot of literature around, for example, Teresa Caldeira, which you quote, then Penglase, again working on police violence in the favelas, Shepherd Hughes' work on death squads in Rio. I wonder, how do you look at this, at the question of the public support for all these measures, but also resistance, right? Because Brazil had a very progressive government for a number of years before Bolsonaro, the PST. So I wonder, where is resistance in your presentation? And that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Anna, for your thorough comments.